Welcome to the Determined Truth Podcast.
Want the truth? You can't handle the truth.
Where we aim to explore questions of truth, the scriptures, and what it means for the church today. Here are your hosts, Rob Dalrymple and Vinnie Angelo.
Hey everyone, welcome in. We're at the only part in Galatians that anyone wanted to hear. The fruit of the Spirit. Well, no, it's just, I mean, that's what it tends to be like. If you know anything about Galatians, true. It's this section. So we're not going to start with the fun stuff. Whoever wants to start with the fruit of the flesh.
No, let's talk about how bad the sinners are. Let's start with that.
That's right.
How bad those people are.
That's reform style.
The not people like us are.
Right. Thank God you didn't make me like them.
The they. Yeah.
The they.
the Jewish prayer. Thank God that you didn't make me. Yeah, we won't say it anymore. Okay.
Exactly. Cool. So we're in Galatians chapter 5, and we'll start at verse 18.
Yeah.
And that's kind of picking up this section. Actually, you say 18, but going off my Bible division, the versification, they have it starting at 16 in chapter 5.
So you can go back to 16. That's fine.
Yeah, just to read it, just to have the fuller context.
Sure.
So we'll go 16 through 21. So live by the Spirit, I say, and do not gratify the desires of the flesh. For what the flesh desires is opposed to the Spirit, and what the Spirit desires is opposed to the flesh. For these are opposed to each other, to prevent you from doing what you want. But if you are led by the Spirit, you are not subject to the law. Now the works of the flesh are obvious: fornication, impurity, licentiousness, idolatry, sorcery, enmities, strife, jealousy, anger, quarrels, dissensions, factions, envy, drunkenness, carousing, and things like these. I am warning you, as I warned you before, those who do such things will not inherit the kingdom of God. Ugh. And I'll start off with this.
Those people.
I don't even want to read this because I'm literally struggling with, I'm going to name my own stuff in real time right here. Enmities, strife,
witchcraft,
anger, quarrels, dissensions, factions. Like even personally in life right now, some stuff going on in my life as it relates to a former congregation I was with, and I'm struggling with these things right now.
Yeah.
And it's funny because some of these things, even before we get into the list themselves, we have that hierarchy of sin. Like, oh, these people don't inherit the kingdom of God. The person who is a fornicator or is a drunkard, like we have the things that we look at as the ideal sin. But how can we actually never, do we ever challenge people on like strife and jealousy and anger and, factions and those sorts of things? It just doesn't seem like that has the same level. We put that in but that makes sense, or we explain it away. I don't know. I'm just doing my own admitting of my own struggles in today's world for me.
Yeah. If I had any on this list, I'd point them out as well, but we can just go ahead and move on to
That's not going to work for you.
Yeah. Yeah. And no one can discuss this with my wife because she's probably, whatever.
She's already blogged about it. She's like, Rob's a saint. I wish I could find something wrong with him. And I haven't in 30 years of marriage.
It was an anonymous post on my website that came from her. So,
guest blogger.
That's what we did. It was a guest blogger. I think we already addressed the issue of the fact that all humanity, Christian, we still struggle with some of these things. The idea being, as a Christian, this doesn't characterize our life, but we still stumble, we still struggle. And so to say that I'm above these things or whatever is not the case at all. And we have to be careful about that balancing act of saying, well, it's okay because we're not perfect, or it's not okay, you can't do any of these things at all. Because one of those sides, it's not okay, you can't do any of these things at all, makes us arrogant as, I'm above these things. And rightly and unjustly oppresses people that are striving to follow Christ, but they know they're struggling. And then on the other side of it is you're just giving a license to sin. And so we have to find that balance between all of these different ideas, and we have to be careful.
So one thing that would be a bad application of the grace and the freedom that we've already talked about in Galatians then would be, I'm actually going to use a real example that I knew of one time. It's a pastor who both you and I know.
Okay.
And a congregant went to this pastor, and this congregant had just a long stretch of a difficult time in his marriage. It was, for all intents and purposes, his marriage was over, right? They were just living together as friends, and this person wanted out. The pastor told the congregant, hey, listen, if you get a divorce, that's fine. God will forgive you.
Oh, wow.
It was kind of like one of those, you're allowed to do this. They didn't really have a reason to get divorced, even with the exception of they just weren't like maybe physically compatible. They were just kind of roommates, but there was no sin. There was no reason to get divorced other than they just were not living in that romantic kind of way. And the pastor said, oh, you could do this and God will forgive you. That's not what we're talking. Like, we don't want to have a license to sin and just be like, but it's cool. God's going to forgive me. We're good. Like that's a wrong application of the grace and freedom we've talked about in Galatians, right?
Yeah, and let's twist it to the other side. You might have someone that's in an abusive situation or a situation of great stress or great trauma, and they don't quote unquote have a justification for divorce, but I think what we need to go is say, okay, the whole situation is something that causes us to grieve, something that over which we're weeping. So we're going to sit there with you in the middle of this, but if at the end of the day that person seeks divorce, we want you to understand the fact that we're with you, we're behind you, we're supporting you, but understand that the gravity, the significance, and the grief that's involved in this entire process. So I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but I'm simply saying that we're not going to just dismiss this as like, okay, don't worry about it, God's going to forgive you.
So along with this, then, just as we start the conversation about sin and works of the flesh, and going back to last week, works of the flesh don't mean physical things where works of the spirit are material things, right? And so flesh is really meaning that sin nature, or that just that former life type thing that people would have had, right? Their pre-Christian life. It's those type of things. Is that another way how you would describe works of the flesh?
Yes, or maybe saying, how about the problem with saying as like pre-Christian is it's like there's Christian, there's non-Christian. And there's two camps, there's us, them. We always have to be careful about us, them camps. And there's validity behind it, but we have to be careful about it, because what we say is, well, we're the good and they're the bad whenever we do us, them. So I would simply say it's the deeds that we do in the flesh without the Spirit of God empowering us, because that means that I'm in that camp too. If I decide, even as a Christian, to not follow the Spirit, it puts me in that camp. And the other thing we have to be careful of, let's go back to Genesis just for a second in our thinking. Genesis 1 and 2 are emphatic. We may have said this before. Are emphatic that all humanity is created in God's image. Male and female, he made them. Genesis 2 describes the formation of Eve as a helper, but that doesn't imply inferiority at all, because the word helper is applied to God more often than not. And it's a companion, it's someone to come alongside. The two were naked and not ashamed. Genesis 2:25, like, what does that verse have to do with anything? Because there's such equality between male and female. There's such unity between the two of them. Okay, so we look at Genesis 1 and 2 and we go, the absolute human dignity of all people, the human value of all persons. It's commonly used for the abortion issue. We're all made in God's image. You can't abort that. Okay.
Yeah.
But then we go to Genesis 3 and we talk about the human depravity. We're all sinners. And what we do so often, though, is we let one trump the other. So that we look at that homeless person and go, oh, you must have made mistakes because you're a sinner. Sure. And I can't give you anything that you might need because all I'm doing is reinforcing your drugs or reinforcing your lifestyle of laziness where you won't get a job. We shouldn't give money to poor families and poor women because they just need to get off their butts and get to work. Okay. Or we look at, oh, the people in Gaza deserve to be slaughtered because they all supported Hamas. They voted for Hamas anyways. Or we need to do this to this group of people. When I was young, Vinnie, it was Haiti. The country of Haiti was deprived, involved in witchcraft and debauchery and all that evil stuff. They deserved the poverty that they got. No one had any understanding, at least in my world, that the poverty was actually imposed by foreign policies. We'll leave it at that for now. That actually caused oppression in that country. So sure, the country is oppressed because of its witchcraft and everything else. But we look at these people and go, you don't deserve my mercy. You don't deserve my grace. You don't deserve my compassion and my empathy because you are this. And so we look at them through the lens of Genesis 3. And I think somehow we need to look at them and go, all persons are to be looked at in the lens of Genesis 1 and 2, beings of value. However, all persons are easily corruptible, easily prone to sin. And how about this, saying it this way? All systems, all entities, so nations, corporations, churches, any group of people can simply use power and wealth for corruption. And look at that. And maybe that system is why that individual is suffering. Sure, they're sinful as well, and they're not contributing to the situation and to the good of the situation, but it's the system that's oppressed them to cause them to be where they are. I think we need to look at it from that lens more than the other lens. So we take this too easily and apply it to the individualism and not looking at this in a more corporate lens.
Sure, absolutely. But I mean, when Paul is challenging the Galatians, and he does give this list of stuff, he's obviously, and I think we talked about this last week a little bit, the list is not exhaustive.
Yeah.
You might even translate it as the works of the flesh are these types of things. It doesn't mean only these things. It's certainly
Correct.
these things, but it's not limited to these sorts of things. So it's not just a checklist of things. But
Correct. Yeah.
While these things are going to be experienced in communities and in systems and communities are also made up of people. So it's both, and it's not just one or the other, right?
Okay, excellent. And what you're pointing out is something that just needs to be reiterated, and that is that the list like this is contextual. It's related to a specific context. Paul gave this list. Doesn't mean that there aren't other sins of the flesh that just aren't listed here. Maybe there are. And he gave this list because of the situation in the Galatian churches that Paul was writing to. And that situation was they're demarcating between good and bad, between the in and the out, between the Jew and the Gentile, between the people of God and the not people of God. And their demarcation as to who's in and who's out was based on ethnicity. And Paul's saying, no, look, what it's based on is a self-centered pride. What they're thinking was a self-centered pride of we are better than you. And so Paul's saying, no, look, when you think that way, you're actually giving into the deeds of the flesh. So when we understand the list in light of that context, we shouldn't just simply say, you're not in because you act this way, because Paul's answer is we all act that way without the Spirit of God. But we look at this and go, Christians are this way, non-Christians are that way. And Paul's like, no, all of us are this way without the Spirit of God.
Yeah. So then let's go with that and even explore the idea of the contextualization of this. And what would this list have meant to the Galatian audience that heard this? So we look at something, and even I'm looking at two different translations right now. So in the NRSV, the first work of the flesh is fornication, whereas in the ESV, it says it's sexual immorality. Well, I'm automatically, because I live in a Western American context of 2025, I'm going to impose what modern sexual immorality issues. I'm going to read that as the issue that Paul is talking about. So let's even maybe explore, what does this list mean in its original context before we get into application of what it looks like to the church today? Would that be a good question to go to?
Yeah, that's exactly the way that we should approach this. That's an excellent statement. The first thing is that they categorized Jew and Gentile. That was the issue. And Jew is in, and the Gentiles who want to come in through Jesus, because now the Jewish community that's being referred to here is a community that's embracing Christ. But they're saying the Gentiles can embrace Christ also, but that's not enough. They need also to be circumcised. They need to become Jewish and do the works of the law, as we've discussed several times. What Paul's simply saying is, okay, let's start with sexual sins, because that was characteristic of the Gentiles. In other words, you can't take this list in parts. Take this list in totality. The Gentiles were certainly characterized by sexual immorality, impurity, and debauchery. The first three items on the list are all sexual sins. But what Paul's doing is saying, okay, but you guys are characterized by discord, by jealousy, by selfish ambition, by dissensions. In other words, it makes you no better than them. So don't take the list as what we do, like the hierarchy of sins. Take this list as in total and say, just because that characterizes that group of people over there, in this case, the Gentiles, it doesn't exclude you, because you also are guilty of these sins. So
is this similar, just to interrupt real quick, is this
please.
similar in Romans 1 and 2? So starting in Romans 1, starting at verse 18 after the introduction.
Yes.
And Paul seems to address the Gentiles in verses 18 through 32, where he's listing very common Gentile type sins and Gentile way of living. And then in chapter 2, starting in verse 1, he doesn't shift it and he doesn't say, hey, this is for the Gentile, this is for the Jew. But then he goes and he basically names the type of things that a Jewish person would be known to be guilty of in their self-righteousness and whatnot.
Let's turn to Romans 2 just for a second, because referring to that actually is a really good illustration. So chapter 1 of Romans 18 through 32, he's saying, you Gentiles do all these things, and as a result of that, you will not inherit the kingdom of God. Therefore,
he doesn't say you Gentiles. He just lists things, but it's obvious that these are Gentile. They would have heard this as these are standard Gentile sins or Gentile ethic. Yeah.
there's also the indication of the fact that the wrath of God is revealed from heaven. This is Romans chapter 1, verse 18, against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth and unrighteousness. So that's characteristic of the Gentile. Even though what was known about God is evident to them, because God's made it evident to them. That's chapter 1, verses 19 and 20. So that even though they knew God, this is talking about those people who knew God but suppressed the truth, which is not the Jewish people, that would be the Gentiles.
Hey everyone, we want to thank you for joining us on today's podcast. And we want to remind you that everything we provide at Determined Truth is free of charge. And this even includes all of the teaching that Rob, Danny, and myself do on a weekly basis in our online Bible studies, live streams, and our coaching for pastors in India and around the world. We don't have any supporters who get special behind-the-scenes access, but we can only do this with the generous support from those of you who can afford to give. So if you'd prayerfully consider supporting us with a fully tax-deductible donation, with anything from $5 a month or more, we will continue to challenge the church to be the church. To give, go to determinedtruth.com and click on the Give tab, or find the link in today's show notes. Thanks.
They didn't honor him as God, but they gave over to foolish things, and they became fools, and they followed immorality and idolatry. And notice the two things that are mentioned here, because this is Galatians 5. Of course, in Galatians 5, it's immorality and then idolatry. In Romans 1, it's idolatry and then immorality. So verse 23, they exchanged the glory of the incorruptible God for an image in the form of corruptible man. Okay, there's idolatry. Verse 24, they gave themselves over to impurity so that the bodies would be dishonored among them. So there's immorality. When we look at the fruits of the Spirit, or when we look at the deeds of the flesh in just a second, we're going to see it's exactly the same thing. The list starts with immorality, and then it goes to idolatry. So this is the Gentiles. All right, they did all these things. They didn't acknowledge God. Therefore, God gave them over. They're lost. But chapter 2, verse 1 says, but you have no excuse, those who pass judgment, because you condemn yourself. Oh, what? What are you talking about, Paul? And he goes on to give this illustration of, you guys know the goodness of God, and yet you yourselves did these things. Verse 11 to say, there's no partiality with God for all. Verse 12, for all have sinned. Without the law will perish without the law, and all who have sinned under the law will be judged by the law. There you go. You put them in another camp over there, but you're also guilty as well. They're not necessarily condemned, and you guys are not necessarily saved. You also can be condemned. So I think that's an important background for Galatians 5, then to say, oh, we go to the top of the list and say, oh, that's what these people are like. And Paul's answer is, yeah, but you guys are like this. If you skip down, and that's why he says at the end of verse 21, those who practice these things will not inherit the kingdom of God. But that includes, if we were to take it to a modern application, Vinnie, we would say Christians and non-Christians. Well, non-Christians, they're immoral persons. Well, yeah, but guess what? You guys are also strife, jealousy, outbursts of anger, disputes, dissensions. Yeah, these are still true of us. So, yeah.
What could we ask of the sexual sins that would be unique to that time? Because we think sexual sins, and we're like, oh, they have a problem looking at porn, where it's like, well, that's probably not going to be their issue at that time. It was just funny because even where I didn't look it up, but I'm assuming sexual sin probably is from porneo, right?
And the implication is adultery and fornication with a prostitute or with somebody other than their spouse. And in the Roman world, that was just common practice. It was just the norm. Having sex with your spouse was okay, but you would regularly have sex with somebody other than your spouse. So that's why it's listed here. It doesn't mean that we're off the hook. What's interesting is they didn't have pornography problems in the same sense as we do. On that note, I don't remember the exact number of people in America. What percentage of Americans struggle with pornography? It's a high number.
Oh, yeah, like 80% or something like that.
Yeah, it's like this, whatever this number is, it's in our church. Because if we got 100 people in our church, and if it's 70% of the people in America or whatever, well, that means there's at least 10 out of 100 in our church. If it's only 10%, it doesn't matter. So you start preaching on sexual immorality. Oh, I'm not cheating on my wife. Well, guess what? You are doing things that are condemned by this particular passage. So it's just condemning sexual immorality. And the point behind that, and the reason why it's highlighted here, Vinnie, is because having sex outside of marriage in the Greco-Roman world is simply common. And so Paul's giving this list to say, see, that's what the Gentiles do. And you guys think you're okay because you're not like the Gentiles. And Paul's answer is, no, you guys do hatred and jealousy and fits of rage and selfish ambition and envy and factions. All that stuff at the bottom of the list is what you guys do. The second group of sins are religious sins.
Mhm.
And again, depending on your translation and my translation, we might have different words. So for our listeners, whatever translation that you're looking at now, items number 4 and 5 are idolatry and witchcraft. I think yours might have said sorcery, right?
Mhm.
So, and all that is, remember, the two great sins, the two great commandments are love the Lord your God and love your neighbor as yourself. What that means then is the two great sins are idolatry, not loving the Lord your God,
Mm.
and immorality, not
Mhm.
loving your neighbor as yourself.
Okay.
So that's clearly the top of the list. In other words, that's what the pagans do. They don't do the two great commandments, sexual immorality and idolatry. And that's what we're looking at. It's acts of idolatry, which goes on the list. We wouldn't even put that on our list today, talking about contextuality. I don't think we would put idolatry at the top of our list because it has this implication of following an idol.
Like
We
a
have
physical
idolatry.
shrine. Yeah.
Yeah,
Mhm.
We have idolatry
Mhm.
in our culture, in the Western culture. Like
Absolutely.
obviously, our brothers and sisters in India are listening right now. They have idolatry because of the Hindu gods, and
Yep.
it's just very prevalent. But we do have idolatry; it just doesn't look the same. I think we
Mhm.
discussed last week. It might be the truck that's in your garage, or it might be the goods in your home, or it might be your bank account, or it might be whatever else it might be. I think that's the idea behind immorality and idolatry.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's interesting. We have that as a religious sin, and we might not initially categorize it as a religious thing, but it's anytime you're putting something in the place of God's position,
Yeah.
of Yahweh's position.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Which
Yeah.
let me stop for a second then, because this goes back to what I said earlier. What we need to do is look at the world not as us, them, two buckets, but as kingdom of God, kingdoms of the world.
Mhm.
Because what the kingdoms of the world do is that they don't start with Jesus is Lord. They don't start with God's the source of wisdom. They don't start with we get understanding, wisdom, discernment, and our ability to rule wisely and well from God. Instead, it's from self. And from
Mhm.
self often means those in power. That's
Yeah.
why I said it's the systems, it's the group, anything that has power is easily going to be corruptible because they want to maintain that power. They want to exercise that power, maybe for good, but often at the expense of the poor and at the expense of the marginalized. And then we
Mhm.
go back to our conversations that we did a few podcasts in the book of Revelation. And we recognize the fact that the nations themselves are actually supposed to be the object of our love, the object of our witness, the object of our testimony. We bear witness to Christ to them. So even though they are part of the system of the beast, and we all are essentially, but they are giving allegiance to the beast, and the beast is giving oppression and persecution to the church, we don't look at them as them. We look at them as us prior to redemption, as us through whom Christ died, as us for whom we are to lay down our lives for them. So I think this us, them is dangerous here. And I think that's exactly what Paul's getting at in this list. It's like, okay, here's the them for you guys, but now let's look at the rest of the list. And note this also, Vinny, the first part of the list, sexual sins, there were 3 items in the list. And then religious sins, there's 2 items in the list. The next set
Yeah, I
has
was gonna ask you
8
that.
items in the list.
Yeah.
This is clearly the focus. And this list of what we might say is social sins, and it's the longest because it's going to include the Jews as well. It's going to include all of us as well. And we're all condemned without the Spirit of God. That's obviously the point. I'm not sure if you want to add something there or not.
Well, I was just going to ask on this list of what we call social sins, like, hatred, discord, jealousy, these sorts of things. I think we're probably pretty good, especially in the church, of calling out some of those other sins. It's easy to call it, whether it's from the pulpit or within the congregation, it's easy to call out the sexual immorality. It's easy to call out obvious idolatry issues, but we don't always do it. But that can become a thing. Hey, you're giving up coming to church because you're spending all your time and money in travel baseball, and so you're not even fellowshipping because 2 or 3 times a month you're traveling to wherever to play baseball. Like, you've made that an idol. Like, those are things that we hear regularly preached from the pulpits. But what about some of these other social sins? Like, what is a selfish ambition? What is factions? Like, these sorts of, or envy.
Okay.
And these sorts of things happen in the church today, but are they more socially acceptable, even though Paul actually spends more time addressing them?
Well, they're also more hidden because the passive aggressive comes in here, right?
Okay.
So first off, putting it in the context of the Greco-Roman world to whom Paul was speaking, notice as you go down the list, well, hatred is obviously directed towards others. All right. Discord is the opposite of peace. Well, that's what the Judaizers and those who are advocating for the Gentiles to be circumcised, that's what they were ultimately doing. They're creating factions. Look at the bottom of the list. Dissensions, factions, envy. You are envious that these Gentiles come into the faith without having to be circumcised, without having to do all these things. So it's clearly targeting that divisive group within the church to whom Paul was writing. As far as modern day situation goes, and by the way, fits of rage, that was culturally acceptable in that day, because what you do is you're defending your honor. If someone shames you, you with rage defend your honor. I mean, that was actually expected of the culture, that you do these things. So you would expect some within the community of God's people would be doing fits of rage, even though we might not see it as much today, because we do have this more Judeo-Christian ethic that's infiltrated our culture. So we look at fits of rage as something that's not socially acceptable.
Sure.
Right? But then you look at dissensions and factions. And I can tell you, every single pastor that I know of, especially the lead pastor, is trying to navigate a congregation, trying to lead a congregation, whether it's 50 or 5,000, to Christ-likeness, and knowing that he does, as he or she does so, they are navigating factions. And I don't want to feed this group, but I don't want to and isolate that group. But I need to say this right now. And how do I say this right now without angering these people? It's because factions are there, but they're subtle, and they're whispered, and they're cloaked in righteousness. But we're doing what's right. I can't believe that group over there is letting those people into the church. No, we're letting those people into the church because we're trying to minister to them. And hopefully, as a result of ministering to them, they might actually join our Sunday group as well. I'm not speaking from real examples, Vinnie, but it happens all the time. And so it's that passive aggressiveness that's far more dangerous, and it's just as bad as dissensions and factions and envy.
Yeah, no, agreed.
So,
This does really make a sharp contrast in this list of the works of the flesh, because it really does start pushing inward, which, I mean, this is the heart of idolatry. It's ultimately fulfilling my own desires and being about self.
Yeah, exactly. And then when you get to the church, you cloak it in righteousness, and therefore, of course, I'm okay. I'm not like that. I'm not one of them. I don't do these things. Everybody else does. It's this us-them mentality that we use in all kinds of other aspects as well. All right, the last two items on the list here, just to finish this up, are sins of drinking, and of course, drunkenness and orgies. And this is very common Greco-Roman thing there. We might expect from what we're trying to say, what we're trying to set apart is that, these are things that characterize the churches that Paul was writing to. And we know in Corinth, it does, right? The wealthy were getting drunk on the communion, but Corinth hasn't happened yet as far as the time that Paul writes Galatians, as far as we know. So we don't know if Paul's picking up on something specific to the churches of Galatia or not, or if he's back to the Greco-Roman world. So he starts with the Greco-Roman world, goes to issues that affect all the people, including the people in the churches, and then it goes back to the Greco-Roman world, or is he simply pointing out something that we don't know about in terms of the Greco-Roman world that's infiltrated the church as well in this list? Hard to say.
Okay. Do you want to move into the fruit of the Spirit?
Absolutely.
Let's look at that. And it's interesting, growing up around the church and church culture, these are always understood, I guess understood for me as things that you do. Like, these are personal things. And obviously it has to start with personal, but I remember teaching on this topic a number of years ago and really meditating on it and realizing these things aren't things done in and of themselves. They're actually, you can't actually do the fruit of the Spirit alone on a desert island. These are things that are meant to be done in community.
Sure, exactly.
And so they're outward, we call them outward facing type things. They're not merely just things that I need to do for me.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So there's 9 items in here, which we spent a lot of time counting things when we did our Revelation study. So that's interesting. Is there any nuance or any maybe hidden thing that Paul's doing by putting 9?
Yeah. Whenever you have a list, always count them. The number of works of the flesh was 15. Maybe it's 5, 5, and 5, because 5 does have some significance, and we see it a couple of times. We'll see it in the book of Colossians. We don't know. That's the best way we can answer that question. So 9 here, John Stott breaks this into 3 groups of 3, and if that's the case, you have a triad of trinities. But you got to be careful. But there's usually something behind it. Count, figure it out. If you can't figure it out, let it go. Don't make some wild prophecy about how the world's going to end tomorrow.
Sure.
It's not tomorrow. It's at least a week away.
Exactly. So, okay, I'll read through this. So
Yeah.
Galatians 5:22 through 26.
Yeah.
By contrast, or what does it say? In ESV, it just says, but
Yeah.
NRSV says, by contrast.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah. The fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, generosity, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. There is no law against such things. And those who belong to Christ Jesus have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires. If we live by the Spirit, let us also be guided by the Spirit. Let us not become conceited, contempting against one another, envying one another.
And there's that envying again, which is in the list of the deeds of the flesh. Yeah. So John Stott breaks them into three groups of three, and that might be legit. His first group is attributes of God, love, joy, and peace. The second is attributes to others, patience, temperance, and patience, kindness, and goodness. And then the last are attributes to self, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. That's fine. Well, if that works, that's great. You made an argument, and I don't think I had heard it before. And if I had, I hadn't remembered it, because you did a sermon on this. I think I mentioned this to you before. You did a sermon on this when I was away in Bakersfield. Hey, Vinnie, would you come down and preach for me one of these weeks? I'm going to be gone. And you did a sermon on the fruits of the Spirit, and you made the comment that the word fruit of the Spirit is singular, and that maybe love is the fruit of the Spirit, and that everything else actually flows from what love looks like. I think that's actually pretty profound. It may even be correct. There's only one fruit of the Spirit is love. That's why it's singular. And the rest actually are manifestations of the fruit. Certainly love is paramount, preeminent. It's number one. And I think everything else does derive from it. So I think that's actually a pretty interesting way to go. Love in its core root is not self-seeking. And we may have discussed this before, but it just can't be emphasized enough. It's not, it doesn't seek its own interest. It seeks the interest of others. The best example of love is the cross. Jesus isn't seeking his own interest on the cross. Clearly, he has none by going on the cross, but he's seeking the interest and well-being of everyone else, potentially, depending on how reformed you are. And and that's the model of that. And again, we have to be careful, as we discussed before. Just a quick disclaimer: if you're being abused or something like that, that's not love to allow that to continue. But love is sacrificing your own interest for the sake of someone else. And if there's that last piece of cake on the counter, it belongs to Dad.
Always.
That's just what a loving family does.
Or it could belong to Mom, and if Dad does take it, Mom might get mad. That definitely didn't happen in my house this week with the chocolate cream pie.
If Mom made it, the most loving thing Dad could do is eat it to show his appreciation for it.
Yeah, Mom would disagree on this on Monday of this past week. Mom did disagree. That's good. That happened.
Anything you want to talk about, Vinnie? We could pause.
No, not anymore.
Yeah. So yesterday in my home, is all the coffee cake gone, and I used first come first serve.
Nice.
Hey, look, you sleep, my daughter. You sleep until noon. Of course, there's no coffee cake left.
I agree.
To which my wife said, "Do I need to make some more?" I'm like, "Of course, honey, because I love so much what you do for me." It was just a loving act. So perfect example of my home.
That's good. That's good.
Of me manifesting the fruit of the Spirit.
Yeah, but I mean, we don't want to sleep on the concept of love. This is something that I think it's such an easy Sunday school VBS type answer. It's flannel graph, and it's like, okay, we know love, but really, this is really what the fruit of the Spirit is. It's how well I know my doctrine of whatever, or it's truth and love. I'm giving you the truth because I love you, and the truth is you're going to go to hell, and I could be a total jerk about how I say it, but that's actually demonstrating my love for you. You know, we have this mindset of what love is, and no, love is actually a thing, and you don't want to sleep on Jesus saying, what are the two greatest commandments? Loving God and loving neighbor. It's that the world knows you're my disciples by the love you have for one another. I seriously don't think we give that enough credence. We don't practice that. We don't actually believe Jesus's words when he says those things. And so the more I study theology, the more I realize, love is such a prevalent role in the biblical story, and we skip over it because we think it's kindergarten VBS.
It's grieving, Vinnie. It really is, because God is love. It's the essence of who God is. The two great commandments Jesus says are love the Lord your God, love your neighbor as yourself. Well, then who's my neighbor? And Luke's gospel. Well, who's my neighbor? Go and do what that Samaritan did. He didn't care who his neighbor was. He treated everyone as if it was a neighbor. And yet what we do is we then say, but not that, not that. They don't deserve it because they did drugs. That's why they're homeless. They did this because, there are no men in the family. That's why, other people of color, all their dads are in prison. That's why the kids are poor. It's like, no, there's a lot more factors involved than just simply that. But we make it us, them. And then what we do is we go, okay, therefore I don't need to act lovingly towards them. Whether it's a war and Haiti, as we mentioned already, the people in Haiti doing witchcraft, it's like, whoa. And then what we do, Vinny, which is just as bad, if not worse, is we actually make God into our image. Like, okay, I don't have to love that person or that group of people because they voted for Hamas or because they're doing witchcraft or because they're doing drugs. That's why they're homeless. I don't have to love them. And God doesn't love them either. That's why he brings his wrath upon the wicked and the unrighteous. It's like, whoa, wait a minute. I don't deny, as we discussed plenty of times in our Revelation study, that there is wrath and judgment on Judgment Day. But the biblical story is a love story. I saw this yesterday. The book's coming out in a month and a half. I don't remember who wrote it, but there's a book coming out by a biblical scholar that you would know the name of. I can't think who it is. And the argument of the book is that love is the primary characteristic of Paul's writings, that love is the dominant feature of that. I'm like, exactly. I can't believe that we have to write books on this because it's been so lost in the church. It's this cruciformity of Michael Gorman, of Scott McKnight. Love is the essence of Paul and of his doctrine of his theology. And he got that from Jesus, and Jesus got it from the Torah. And when I wrote Revelation, a love story, it's like people are actually going to push back at that because Revelation is about God's wrath. It's like, no, we made God in our image instead of starting with God's image and filtering on down. So yeah, we could go for a long time on this. And I think you're absolutely right.
Well, and so let's use this as a springboard. So my thesis when I preached that sermon was that if the fruit of the Spirit is love, because love is singular, is singular. It's not, they are these things. It is this thing. So then my thesis was, therefore, every other fruit that we look at ought to be through, I think I'm going back like a decade now, but looking at it like a jeweler would look at a diamond, and you look at these different aspects of a diamond. And so it would be a loving joy, a loving peace, a loving patience. That was my thought. So joy, if we were to just go through some of these fruits and define it, what do we mean by joy? Does that mean we're just happy all the time?
Yeah. Very common, by the way, that joy is misunderstood. Joy is associated in Scripture most often with trials and tribulations and hardships. So James chapter 1, verse 2, that you might know very well. Consider pure joy, my brothers, when you face trials of many kind. There you go. James chapter 1, verse 2. Consider joy when you encounter various trials. Because joy is to be characteristic of the Christian life, but we know throughout Paul, and obviously the book of Revelation, that the Christian life is going to be one of suffering. If they persecute me, they're going to persecute you also. So, but we still love the people who persecute us, and we still receive that persecution with joy. That doesn't mean with happiness. I'm so excited. I'm glad I'm suffering persecution. It just means that I have a hope that something better is going to come about as a result of this.
Okay.
There you go. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. And I don't like that message right now, but I will receive it.
I don't think any of us do.
No. Peace.
Yeah.
Is peace just the absence of conflict?
No. Yeah. And that we can go on for a long time on that as well. Certainly biblical peace and a just peace means that there's no longer not only conflict, but it's a just resolution that's equitable for everyone. But this peace here is a peace that says, I'm going to experience the hope and the joy that's in Christ in the midst of this conflict and tribulation, because I know that ultimately through peace, the kingdom of God will come instead of responding with violence. So I'm not going to fix this in some quick way that creates an injustice, but I'm going to allow it to continue and persevere through it because I know that justice can come about as a result of it.
Okay.
Or I hope that justice will come about as a result of it.
Okay. Patience.
Yeah, we could talk for a long time, and I know we're running out of time. So patience, I think I've referred to this book before, but Alan Creeder wrote a book called The Patient Ferment of the Early Church. And his subtitle is The Improbable Rise of Christianity in the Roman Empire. And he did an incredible job of going back 2nd, 3rd, and 4th, and possibly even 5th century documents. So he did original research, ancient Christian writings of the early church fathers and early Christians, and said, The question he was asking is, how did the Christian church survive? We've talked about in our study of 1 Corinthians, how did the church even get going? Because they're preaching foolishness to the Gentiles and a stumbling block to the Jews. This doesn't make any sense. We preach Christ crucified. Why is anybody going to believe this? And he's asking the question, like, okay, if the Christians are persecuted, if they're oppressed, if they're marginalized, if they're socially ostracized, if they're economically oppressed, why would anybody join this movement? And he said, because they practice the Christian virtue of patience. And what he meant by that was patience, this idea of long suffering, of being slow to anger, of being gracious and loving, even in the midst of oppression. So you take these Christians in the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th century, and they're marginalized, they're ostracized, they're persecuted, they're oppressed socially, economically, and yet they still love their neighbor. And they still did all these great things for people. And so he was saying they knew that these Christians would go to that home at 5 a.m. on a Wednesday morning. And they're like, what are you guys doing in that house? But then they see those people that went into that house on a Wednesday morning, and they see them in the marketplace later on that day, and they're the nicest people you'd ever want to meet. They're doing business fairly. They're treating people justly. And they said, what is it about you guys? Well, come find out. Why don't you join our meeting on Wednesday mornings and learn more? And that was that attractional model that brought people into the faith. So it's amazing, this ability to bear wrong without committing wrong in response. The ability to endure attacks and insults without attacking an insult in response. Remember, when you're attacked and insult in the Greco-Roman world, you've been shamed and you need to defend your honor. They didn't do that. They endured for the sake of God, and they reflected God in their virtue and their nature. And it's a tremendous, tremendous story. So patience is not just sitting at red light, which I do not have this virtue, waiting for cars to come. Because if that guy in front of me would just go, there's 3 lanes of traffic. Come on, Vinnie. There's 3 lanes of traffic coming. There's no car in the right-hand lane. You can turn into it safely. The traffic's in the other 2 lanes. You can go. We'll be fine. But no, they got to wait. Okay. And then the left-hand turn arrow goes for that other lane right there. And that means that the oncoming traffic is no longer going because it's a green arrow. That they now have a red light. Just look at that light over there. It's green for them, Vinnie.
You're a patient man.
No, and then unless they're making a U-turn, you can go right on red. So you know what that person needs? They need me to honk my horn and remind them.
And you know what you need? You need Jesus.
Well, you know what I need? I need to realize that when I honk my horn at that person, and then they finally do go, and I finally do go, and I look over, and they're a member of my church. That was not a good move.
Did that happen?
We have an amendment in the United States, right? It's a constitutional amendment. I don't have to answer that question. Is that correct?
Yeah. Got it. You don't want to self-incriminate.
Yeah, well,
okay.
I'm just not answering. Doesn't mean I'm guilty. I'm not answering.
Okay. You're right.
Can we go on to the next one? Kindness, please.
Sure. Well, and just real quick to touch on patience. When I taught on this, I'm going to
don't do that to me. That is so mean. Hurry up! Just say it. I'm gonna whisper. I hope nobody else could hear me, by the way.
It's a whisper room. You're okay.
Okay, you would. Anyway, come on. We don't have time. Hurry up.
Someone's not patient. So you have the idea though of patience. I use the example of if someone asks you to hold. I was teaching at a men's breakfast on this one. So I said, if someone asked you to hold a cinder block and be like, "Hey, can you do this for 20 seconds?" You can do it. You're counting down the time. But if I would just say you have to hold the cinder block until I tell you to stop, that takes patience because you don't know when the ending of this is going to be. And I think that for me, like that's the way I think of that idea of long suffering. We could deal with going to the doctors and getting our blood drawn if we don't like needles, because we know it's only going to be in and out. I know it's going to be done in 30 seconds, but I don't know when I have to deal with pain or an indefinite injection and with an IV or something that might feel uncomfortable. It's just there. And I think that encapsulates the idea of long suffering. It's not just saying, okay, I'm going to deal with this and then I'm out. This just might happen and we don't know when it's going to end. And so what is our loving patience like in that time? How do we bear this thing? Or even, I guess we'll talk about this in Galatians 6 when we get to that next week. Like, how are we bearing other people's sin? Like, what does that look like?
Right.
And it's just this indefinite thing. And so we'll get to that then, but it has to be attached to a love. It's not something you're griping on.
Exactly. And that's why these fruits are not self-seeking, seeking the interest of
Yeah.
others, because my impatience, I'll name it.
Yeah.
My impatience is self-centered. It's not focusing on that other person's, whether it was an old lady or not, we're not going to say, who is concerned for her safety and trying to drive cautiously. You ever do that, by the way? You honk and then the car says like a student driver. You're like, oh, dang it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Exactly.
I haven't done that recently.
You haven't done that at all this year.
I haven't done that at all this week.
This week. There you go. Okay. Kindness.
We're
We'll
like
move ahead.
30 days into this month, Vinnie.
That's what I
That's
said.
a long time.
A long time. Yeah. The bar is high for you, my friend.
That's pretty low.
Okay. Kindness and goodness. These kind of almost sound like the same thing. Are these just synonyms?
Not necessarily. So
Yeah.
kindness, of course, is doing goodness and doing right and caring for somebody else. I guess you probably could be able to define these synonymously, but I think they're overlapping.
Yeah.
How about this, by the way? Practicing the love of others. The exhortation is try to be exceptionally kind to one person today. Just
That's good.
be wherever, at the store, wherever you might be, just be exceptionally kind. And by the way, it's so cool when you do that. And I thought about this before, but I was at the grocery store a month or so ago after that lady finally made the right and I was able to get there on time before it closed. Another story. Anyway, and there was a woman in the bakery section, and she was unemployed. She was back there baking cakes or doing whatever. And it was like 9 o'clock at night. So she was probably cleaning up or whatever, right? And she just, brightness of her face, she's like, "Hi, sir, how are you?" And I'm well, how are you? And she just made her day. And I thought, wow, just doing that didn't take much effort, but it made everything for that person. And I thought, wow, what if I did that at least once a day? By the way, Vinnie, do it to your wife.
Of course.
Ooh.
Especially after you eat the last piece of cake.
Well, I think that was exceptionally kind.
Yes, it was. You know what's funny though? We oftentimes use kind and nice as synonymous, and I didn't know how to parse those out. And I heard a comedian, so I can't say what the comedian said, but I saw a clip a couple years ago, and this is actually a great way to describe the difference between kindness and niceness.
Okay, cool.
Because niceness is not one of the fruit of the spirit. You can be passive aggressive and nice. This is someone who she was a comedian.
Are you speaking from personal experience there, Vinnie?
Very much so.
Okay, the way you said it was pretty much, sorry.
No,
it was a tell.
Yeah. So this comedian said she had lived the first time she came to the West Coast, because she's from a New Yorker, and she was surprised. She was like, I realized the difference between niceness and kindness. She said, and you know that because you've lived on the East Coast, so you probably
I know New Yorkers really well, so
okay.
I have a good idea where you're going with this. Yes.
So it was, her shtick was, and I'm not going to use the colorful language that she used.
Okay.
But she's like, if your car breaks down in California, everyone is so nice, and they're like, "Oh, I'm so sorry," and they provide all this nice empathy on like, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I hope someone helps you out." If your car breaks down, she's all, but no one's kind.
But no one actually helps you out. They just wish you well.
So she's all, New Yorkers are not nice, but they are very kind. Your car breaks down and someone sits and they help you and they start blasting you and what the heck's your problem? Why don't you know how to fix your own tire and blah, blah, blah. And they're just ragging on you for being incompetent and making fun of you. They're doing this while they're kneeling down and they start changing your tire for you.
Exactly.
If the tire's the problem, but they're berating you the whole time.
Give me a beer.
So, so they're like, New Yorkers are very kind, but they're not nice. Whereas Californians and West Coasters are very nice, but they're not kind. They won't actually do anything for you. And so I'm like, oh, that's actually pretty funny.
Yeah.
So kindness, though, if that's the standard, if this comedian's standard of kindness is what kind is, there's something that it's not just being pleasant with someone, though. There's got to be, I don't know, would you maybe say an altruistic motive in your kindness? Like, I'm doing this for the sake of, I just want to be kind to you for the sake of you. I'm not going to be nice to the baker because it's going to make me look like a very nice person. I want you to have a good day.
I want you to feel well.
Exactly. Yeah.
Exactly. And Romans 2:4 says that it's the kindness of God that leads you to repentance. that God didn't give you what you deserved, that
Yeah.
instead gave you kindness that brings us to repentance. Exactly. And then
Mm.
goodness is making sure that good things are being done, not just being kind, but good things are being done. So yeah.
Yeah.
Very good.
And,
Okay.
and again, with goodness, that takes me back real quick. If you go back to our interview with Scott McKnight, when we interviewed him on Church Called Tove, which is back in like July of 21, he spends a lot of time obviously talking about goodness. Tove means good, but even the Old Testament background of Tove in the New Testament concept of goodness and gospel and all. I remember he had mentioned that. So go back if you want to listen to that interview. Okay. We also have a couple other ones: faithfulness, gentleness, self-control.
Very good. Faithfulness, of course, is doing and being faithful to what God has called us to do and to be, adhering to promises that we've made. It's a person of integrity, a person who sticks to their word, a person that does what they say they were going to do and does what they were called to do. They're faithful to that responsibility and to that task. And I think that, marriage is an example of that. Being faithful within marriage is being faithful to a pledge and to a promise, being faithful to a commitment. Gentleness is often meekness and humility. This was not a virtue in the ancient world. Of course, in the ancient world, you were gentle or you were meek because you didn't have anything. You were shamed and you were poor and whatever else. So it's this kindness and giving and treating others with, how do I say, you think of a good word here, Vinnie? Treating others with meekness and treating others with gentleness and compassion. And yeah, how's that? Self-control is moderation, temperance, keeping one's passions, keeping one's moods in check. In the ancient world, self-control was not necessarily a virtue, especially if you would have to be defending your honor. So it wasn't expected necessarily to be a virtue, but it's actually one of the requirements for being a pastor. And when you look at 1 Timothy and Titus, someone who maintains self-control, moderation, restraint. Athletes, of course, demonstrate self-control when they work out, when they exercise, when they're committed to their task and to their endeavor. You see self-control regarding sexuality in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. And it's a discipline that's needed to perform a task. Self-control.
That's good. It's interesting. I think it was, I know I heard Doug Moo talk on this once, and I think it was in the context of the fruit of the Spirit. But he made the point, I think, making that connection from self-control, especially to the pastoral role. And he made that, or even gentleness. And he made the point saying, it's interesting how when it comes to pastoral leadership and church leadership, we use the term moral failing, right? And we always know what that means. That means, sexual failing or financial failing. And he made the point, why don't we use that term when it comes to a pastor who is not gentle or doesn't exercise self-control? So when we look at these other ministerial requirements, we give it away. We allow those things as long as it's not, once again, sex or money. That's a moral failing. And his point is, why isn't a moral failing when someone isn't gentle? Why do we just reserve those things for sexual things? And I think that's another one of the things we need to take way more seriously.
Absolutely. All right, let's finish up really quickly here. We've gone a little bit too long. So verse 16, I think your translation says something different, but the Greek, the word walk is probably a better translation. So I say walk by the Spirit, verse 16, and you won't carry out the desires of the flesh. Then you look at verse 25. If we live by the Spirit, let us walk by the Spirit. So you see, this passage is framed by walking by the Spirit. In the middle, by the way, it says live by the Spirit. Verse 18, if you're led by the Spirit or live by the Spirit. And then verse 25, if we live by the Spirit. So you have this idea of walking by the Spirit is living by the Spirit. This is what we're supposed to be characterized by and who we are, because that is the God that we represent. That is the God that we are his image bearers to make known. And that's also what ultimately brings justice to the world. Remember, the one who hungers and thirsts for righteousness. That's what justice looks like. And I think we would include on this as well, just as, that we weep and we grieve with those who are marginalized, with those who are oppressed, with those who are suffering. I think that's also part of what it means to have these fruits of the Spirit as opposed to the deeds of the flesh.
Yeah, no, that's good.
Very cool.
Hey, we did that. Look at this. We're just plowing through this book. So next week, are we gonna be able to finish it up next week?
Yeah, I think our goal will be to finish up. Chapter 6 has a few great thoughts. We spent more time in Galatians than I think we planned on spending, but we got into some issues I think were good issues to get into. That's great. We'll finish up.
And hopefully having a guest on as well.
Hopefully having a guest on in a couple of weeks as well to discuss Galatians and maybe one to discuss Ephesians. And then we'll get into Ephesians in a few weeks.
Fantastic. All right, man. Well, thank
All
you very much.
I gotta get out
And,
of here. I gotta go quickly. Are we done?
No, hang on. I want to do a check-in real quick. Hang on. This is your call to action for people. Hang on.
Hurry up.
And I do need to go. I'm going to let you calm down there. You practice patience. No, people. I know you're listening still because we haven't stopped talking. The last review was from August of 2024. Come on, guys. What are we doing here? That was like half a year ago. That was last year. Who has first person to leave a review gets an autographed copy of the third book Rob will write from now. Okay, that's a big deal. Yes,
it says you, so you're paying for it. Okay, cool.
Yeah. No, you're gonna be big time by then. They're gonna give you so many copies. So? Yeah, it's gonna be huge.
My head's big already.
Enough about me. Enough about me. What do you think about me?
Yeah, I know what you think, Vinnie. How do you get that thing through a door?
It's like an orange on a toothpick. Okay. All right, man. We'll see everyone later, and goodbye.
I want to thank you for joining us on today's podcast, and we would love for you to share the work of Determined Truth with others. Please follow this podcast and give a review on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Your review will go a long way towards helping others find this podcast. Then share it with others so that we can get the word of the gospel of the kingdom to more people.